Hello everyone, welcome back to Lowlands Wargaming. It's Kevin here and we're back for another in-depth video with an army discussion. This time, well, we're going to the high seas and we're going to talk about the Corsairs of Umbar. Welcome. So Corsairs of Umbar, a very interesting army, not shown in the movies, well, not a whole lot at least, but they were enough that they got a Peter Jackson model because he did a cameo. In this video we'll be going over the army, what units do they have, what heroes do they have, how do you play them, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, and how do you play against them. So please join us for this episode. It will be a long one again, so grab a snack, maybe something to drink, maybe some rum, that would be quite fitting, and let's dive straight into it. So let's start off with the army bonus for the Corsairs because it's a very important part of the army, and that's that every model that has the Corsair keyword gets the Backstabber special rule. Backstabbers, for those that are unaware, means that if your enemy is trapped, all of your, the models with the rule get a +1 to rolling wounds when they're making strikes. So not only are you getting double dice because the opponent is trapped, you're also getting +1 to wound, which means that basically anything that is trapped, as long as you win the fight, is pretty much dead, which kind of really rewards you for hunting traps and having a certain play style while you envelop the opponent or pin them against a piece of terrain. So if you're a good player and you know how to, take advantage of it, you can get a lot out of the army bonus. And it's a very powerful army bonus, which means that Corsairs will very rarely be seen as yellow allies to anyone, because losing the army bonus is a pretty big deal for the Corsairs. So let's start off with the heroes. The first hero, of course, is always going to be Dalamir, a hero of legends, the leader of the Corsairs. For 90 points, you're getting a whole lot. He's got 3 attacks, only 2 wounds, only 2 might, and 2 will, but he does have 3 fate, and he has a slew of special rules that make him very interesting indeed. He's got Stalk Unseen, so he's very hard to shoot at from a distance if you manage to get some terrain in between you and the opponent. He's got Bane of Kings, which is basically venom, so he rerolls all wounds. He's got Throwing Daggers, but he's also got a Smoke Bomb that he can throw. On a shoot value of 3+, it hits most of the time. And when you do hit, the enemy model takes a strength 1 hit, which is not a big deal, but they suffer the effects of the channeled Transfix spell, so they can't resist it using normal means, but they can spend a will point to automatically negate the effect. So it won't do much against enemy heroes because they usually have will points, because you don't have any other casters in this army other than the Knight of Umbar, who we'll discuss later. So usually it's not that worthwhile against heroes unless they have like 1 will and you're expecting to throw a smoke bomb on them multiple times, but it's very potent against small monsters or actual monsters, things like spiders, cavalry units, troll, anything that doesn't have will basically, and that's scary enough that you want to lower the fight value. Also against elves it's very useful because you're only fight 5, you do have access to strike, but why use strike when you could just throw a smoke bomb at an elf and half their fight value for free. So very potent hero, very cheap for what he does, very killy, surprisingly survivable because he can also never be trapped as long as he's still standing, so enemy cavalry heroes will mess up your day if you lose a fight against them. But in any other situation you're pretty good because you have Stalk Unseen and you have 3 fate points, so it's very hard for the enemy to get a cheeky leader wound on you. If they manage to burn off all your fate, you're in trouble though, and it's quite possible that he will die because, like all Corsairs, he has very low defense. A very good hero. Of course, the first hero that you take when you build a Corsairs list, he's pretty much an auto-include. Now the next named hero in the list is actually a more recent addition from Gondor at War. It's Delgamar, and I always confuse these two because Dalamir and Delgamar, let's face it, they sound pretty similar. He's got a similar stat line in that he has 3 attacks, fight 5, 2 wounds, but he's got 3 points of might, 1 will and 1 fate. So he's coming in at 75 points if I remember correctly. He's very cheap for what he does again, which is a recurring theme with the Corsairs. And you definitely want him in most of your lists as soon as you can squeeze him in, because the 3 points of might are very important to have. Your leader doesn't have that many to begin with. Getting heroic moves is very important in the list, especially if you're running a lot of Throwing Daggers, if you're running a lot of regular Corsairs instead of Reavers, which we'll touch upon later. And his special thing is that he's got a 3-inch quasi-banner, where he can make a Corsair in a fight reroll a dice, but if they lose the fight, they stake a strength 2 hit from his whip. So the whip rule doesn't actually count as a banner, it's just a reroll. So it's actually cumulative with other banner effects, which means if you have a bosun nearby or Suladon or regular banner nearby, then as long as there's 2 Corsairs in a fight, you can reroll 2 dice. You do run the risk that if you lose the fight, you take a strength hit on your Corsair, but if you're smart about it, you separate your dice so that the front dice, the front guy, is the dice that you reroll with Delgamar, and the back one is the one that you reroll for banner, so that when you lose the fight, the front guy is likely to die anyways, and you don't run the risk of also losing your spear support if you rerolled that one with Delgamar. Very powerful effect. Getting multiple banner effects into fights is really, really strong, because if you roll higher, you win, and if you win, you don't lose guys and you kill the enemy. So Delgamar really helps you win more combats and call heroic moves with his might pool. So he's a very good support hero for your infantry line. And I say line because Corsairs don't typically fight in lines, because you're trying to get traps. So the more chaotic a fight is, the more in your advantage it usually is. Next up, we got a few unnamed heroes for the Corsairs. Let's start with the captain, the good old captain. 50 points, fight 5, which is quite interesting. But other than that, the usual stat line, 2 attacks, 2 wounds, 2 might, 1 will, 1 fate. It's got march, interesting wargear options, 2-handed axe, I think. Crossbow, which is interesting, sword and shield. The usual captain things, they have the same tools at their disposal as their warrior profiles do. The crossbow option is interesting. Some people run a captain as like a shooting hero of a warband full of arbalesters, and then you have like this static gun line. That's not how I would play it. Also, I usually don't take captains, but I'll go over that in the list building section. Pretty standard. Something of note though is that the captain has throwing daggers. I forgot to mention that Delgamar and Dalamir also have throwing daggers. Basically all of the heroes in this list, other than the not piratey ones, have throwing daggers. Very useful to have, especially with some might behind them. You can really, mess up the opponent's plans if you snipe a horse or something with them. Very powerful. But the captain kind of doesn't keep up with the other profiles in the army list. They're just more bang for your buck, which is an overall theme with the Corsairs. The other unnamed hero is the bosun. The bosun is quite interesting. It's kind of a captain profile, but different. 2 attacks, 2 wounds, fight 4 instead of fight 5. So you lose out on that, and you lose out on a might point. You are 5 points cheaper though, and you count as a banner for nearby Corsair models, which is crazy for such a cheap profile. And in addition, the bosun allows you to take reavers. Technically you can take reavers without a bosun, but you would be crazy to do so, which I'll go over when we get to the reavers. But because of the banner effect and of the reavers, the bosun for me is almost an auto take in any Corsair list. Like if I can't bring a bosun and reavers, I'm pretty sad, because they're just really good. Then after that, we've got a few heroes that I personally don't really like. It's the Black Numenorian Marshal, and it's the Knight of Umbar. The Knight of Umbar used to be one of the best named ring wraiths in the game in like a previous edition, or so I've been told. I didn't play at the time, I have to admit. But it's lost a lot of its luster, and it's not that good. If you want to play Magic, I don't think Corsairs is the right army list for you. You kind of want to play Mordor, or Serpent Horde with the poison guy, ring wraith, I forget his name, which I will probably get a lot of flack for in the comments. And Knight of Umbar is, the Black Numenorian Marshal is pretty much the same thing. It's not a bad profile per se. It's just, why take him in the Corsair list? Like, the other heroes are much more efficient and much better at the overall strategy that you're trying to employ. And some people say like, well, yeah, but you can take him on a horse, and it's really useful to have a hero on horse in your list to do like hero combat slingshots or grab objectives or threaten things. And I agree, it's really good to have, and you can do that in the Corsair army list, but you should take Suladon as a green ally instead. We'll go over him in a minute. So these two heroes are in the Corsair army list, but they don't have the Corsair keyword. They don't really do anything that the Corsairs do well. They don't really mesh with the army. The only synergy there is here is that the Knight of Umbar can cast spells, and if you deplete the will store of enemy heroes, then Dalamir smoke bombs are actual, genuine, really big threat. But the Knight of Umbar is also really shit at casting, so it's like a combat ring wraith, but it's not even good at that. So he really lost a lot of his shine when they changed the profile in the current edition. So I might as well transition to Suladon, because I already mentioned him a few times, and you also see him on the table. He's not a Corsair, so I'm kind of cheating here, right? But he might as well be like an honorable member of the Corsair army list. He's such a natural fit to ally in that I would recommend you consider it at anything starting at 500 points and above. Why? Well, I already went over it a little bit. He's on a horse, which is really good. He's a crazy good profile to begin with, like incredibly cheap for what he does. He's got a 6-inch banner, which affects any model, and it is actually a banner for scenarios. So you would have to bring a banner in the Corsair army, which you can do by taking a Black Numenorian with a banner. But instead, you could just take Suladon, and you know, the 25, 30 something points that you save, you just chuck into Suladon, and then he's like, the math works. It's really cheap. And in addition, he can take Serpent Riders with him, which solve your lack of mobility in the army list. I usually take 1 or 2 Serpent Riders with him. They're 5/4 with a poisoned war spear. Like, they're glass cannons. When they win anything they fight against, as long as it's on foot, it's pretty much guaranteed to die. When they lose, they're probably dead. That's just, you know, kind of a fact of life with anything that's Corsairs. It's a low defense army. If you lose, your models will disappear. But just having that little warband of mobility in with your Corsair list is just really good. So you'll see most Corsair armies in tournaments, especially played by like the experienced players going for the top tables. They'll usually have Suladon allied in with a small contingent of Haradrim, specifically Serpent Riders, but sometimes they'll do like, you know, a Haradrim Raider with a bow, or maybe a few foot because they had some points left over and they want to get another hero, or they ran out of warband slots in the Corsair list, things like that. It's genuinely a really good addition, and it makes him pretty much kind of a, you know, honorary member of the Corsair army. So that's it for the heroes. Onto the warriors. So let's talk about the warriors. The warriors of the Corsairs, there's only a few profiles, so it's relatively easy. Let's start with the basic warriors. We've got quite a few of them on the table here, and that's because they are cheap. And your heroes are cheap, and they have lots of warband slots. So Corsairs is like a semi-horde army. You should usually outnumber your opponent, but it's not like Goblin Town where you have like 80 models on the table or something ridiculous like that, but you will have a lot of models, and you'll need them because they do die quickly when you lose a fight, and you like to outnumber, you like to trap your opponent, so it's good. The basic Corsair warrior is 7 points. With a spear, they're 8, with a shield, they're 8, with a shield and a spear, they're 9 points, which is usually how I run them, unless I'm a few points shy, and there will be a few in there with just a shield and no spear. They come equipped with throwing daggers on a shoot value of 4+, which is incredibly good. They have fight 4 out of their own, and other than that, they're pretty standard humans with like Curse 3 and, you know, that kind of stuff. They have really low defense. They don't have armor, so defense 3 or 4 with a shield. Like I said, in the army bonus, they get backstabbers from the army bonus. So they're incredibly glass cannon-y, basically. If they win a fight, they kill something, especially if it's trapped. They have throwing daggers to really mess with your opponent, especially if you have priority where you get the rogue move roll off and you can throw them as you charge in. They're just a really cheap profile for what they do. Having just this fight 4 profile costing only 7 points base, or well, realistically 8 or 9 with the war gear, is just really strong to have. So that's kind of your cornerstone of the army, is these guys with throwing daggers that are really annoying for your opponent. But on their own, they wouldn't really be that scary. They wouldn't do enough. That's where the other 2 profiles come in. So first up, let's talk about the Arbalesters, featured prominently on this table. Arbalesters are 10 points for a dude with a crossbow and a Pavis. So Pavis means that they have defense 6 unless they are in combat. Then they drop down to defense 3. And just having a crossbow for 10 points is a really good deal. In addition to really high defense, this means that you can win the shooting war with pretty much any army other than a select few that I'll go over later. Personally, I like running almost a third of my army as Arbalesters because they're really potent. You are an evil army, so you can shoot into combat. If the opponent has a big, bad, scary hero that will eat any of your Corsair heroes for breakfast, then you can just charge in with like a single Corsair, throw a dagger at him, you know, maybe it does a wound, maybe not, you don't really care. And then they're in combat and you're like, oh yeah, they can do a heroic combat. Well, guess what? You're going to shoot 13 crossbow bolts into that combat. and probably kill your own guy and probably do a wound or two on the enemy hero. If you keep that up for 2, maybe 3 turns, plain. So if the enemy has a big, bad, scary hero, you can just charge it with a single Corsair, shoot a 13 crossbow bolts into the combat, your own guy dies, they can't do a heroic combat, they take a wound or 2, and you repeat for 2 turns, 3 turns until the hero is dead. And in the meantime, the rest of your army is just killing their army. It's the way you can deal with big, scary heroes is arbalesters and shooting into your own combat. So really good value. And they also, you know, because you win the shooting war, your opponent has to react to you, means you can draw them into a disadvantaged position, which you can then leverage to get more traps, which then, you know, allows you to use your other army bonus, as well as, you know, if they have to come to you, there will be 1 turn where you stood still and they get into throwing dagger range, and you just throw a whole bunch of throwing daggers at them, and even more things die. So by the time they get to you, you've already taken quite a few, you know, fatalities. So you can more easily, you know, leverage your advantage in numbers and, you know, wipe out the rest of the army. It kind of snowballs from there. So really good profile. Definitely recommend picking up a lot of them. They're kind of expensive because, you know, they come in metal blisters of 3, but as you can see on the table, I've made quite a few conversions using existing Corsairs and just use other bits to give them crossbows, and it works perfectly fine. Then we have the Corsair Reavers, and these are probably my favorite models of the entire Corsair range. The Reavers are so good. Oh, they're ridiculous. They're 9 points for 2 attack model with an incredibly good special roll. They also have an extra courage, I think, over the regular profile, which is also kind of crazy. And then they have this special rule where they're like mindless killers. Basically, whenever they move, at the start of their move, they have to take a courage test. If they fail the courage test, they have to charge the nearest enemy model that they can reach. If they can't reach an enemy model, they have to charge the nearest enemy model or friendly model that they can reach. And if they can't reach anything at all, they have to move towards the nearest enemy model. If they are within 6 inches of a bosun, they automatically pass this test, but you can also choose to voluntarily fail this test. Why would you? Well, because if you fail the test, or if you choose to fail the test, you don't have to take courage tests to charge terror opponents, which can be very useful, but more importantly, you get a bonus of +1 to wound when you win a fight. And if you combine that with the backstabber bonus, you can get +2 to wound when you win a fight, and you already have 2 attacks, so that's 4 attacks with +2 to wound. And you see where this is going. The Reavers are crazy good at killing anything that they touch as long as they win their combats. Give them some spear support, so you're rolling 3 dice. You have banner effects, you're rolling 4 dice. If you also have Delgamar nearby, you're rolling 5 dice to try and win a combat. We're reaching like Easterling levels of rolls here. You just have 1 lower fight value. But, you know, if you play your cards right, you can really, you know, force multiply onto the Reavers and make sure that they win their combats at least while the rest of your force holds out, and the Reavers will kill anything they touch as long as they got to move first. Because if they don't get to move, they obviously don't get to voluntarily, you know, fill their courage tests, and then they don't get the bonuses. You do have to keep track of this kind of stuff. With the Reavers being so good, I always take a bosun in my army. We'll go over that later with list building, but honestly, the Reavers are just your answer to even more killing power and also terror opponents. You don't have something like Fury in this list, you don't have Bodyguard in this list, but you do have Reavers, and Reavers will charge anything you point them at. You just have to make sure that it's the nearest thing that they can reach. So you can do some clever manipulations here. Let's say your opponent has like a terror-causing enemy hero, but there are 2 other models closer to your Reavers that they can charge. Well, you could move some other Corsairs first and charge those models until basically there's no other base that can fit in there. And then the Reavers tests fail. They have to charge nearest enemy model, but those are not reachable. So then they go to the next nearest enemy model that's reachable, and then you can just charge into the terror thing that otherwise you might have to do tests for. And if you fail the test, you can mess up your formation. So they really reward clever positioning, and they really punish poor positioning from your opponent. Excellent models. And the last warrior profile are the Black Numenorians. Now, I'm going to do the Black Numenorians dirty here and say that they're the worst profile of the army list. And that's saying something. Black Numenorians are incredibly good profiles, but if you want to play them, you're in the wrong army. You have to basically go to Mordor. That's where they make more sense. You could play a Numenorian front rank supported by Corsairs with spears, but honestly, why would you? There's no real incentive there. They don't have the Corsair keyword, so you don't get the army bonus. their fight 4 doesn't benefit the army because the entire army is fight 4. Corsair spear supports don't have strength 4 like Morannons do that you could put behind Black Numenorian, so it just doesn't work that well. The only reason I ever take a Black Numenorian army is if I'm playing a pure army and I want a banner in my army for victory points, because the regular Corsairs can't take banners, but Black Numenorians can, so having a Black Numenorian converted with a banner is very useful to have when you play Corsairs, because you do want that banner for victory points. You don't want to have to go to your opponent because they have a banner and you don't. You want to be able to sit back and shoot them, so you need that banner. If you do take a Black Numenorian with banner, you should also have a Corsair with banner converted and ready to go. In case, you know, the Numenorian dies and passes it off to a Corsair, it's nice to be able to switch to a representative model. Speaking of conversions, so this is a bit of a new segment for us. As you can see, a lot of this army is converted. There's a reason for it. The Corsairs Reavers don't actually have a model. It doesn't exist. So the only way to get them is to either print them, like get a 3D printer, or convert them. Thankfully, the Corsair army is very convertible. They don't have armor style. They don't have, like, they're just wearing regular clothing with some leather straps and whatever. So it's pretty easy to find other bits that you can just mash on there. So I brought some sprues with me, and these are sprues from the Perry Miniatures Agincourt French army box. It comes in 3 sprues and an extra like half sprue of knights, and you can see that these have mostly been plundered. There's not much left on them, so I'll get Sil to like edit like a nice little photo here of a full sprue. It's a really good deal. The Perry brothers are the original sculptors of the entire Middle Earth range, so these miniatures have the exact same scale and exact same proportions as their current work with, you know, for example, these minis. Their minis on the sprues come in like a loose body with no arms and no head, so all of those bits are separate, so you can post them yourself and things like that. They come with crossbows, they come with swords, they come with axes, pikes, etc. Lots of bits that you can do with whatever you want. So I used those sprues to convert basically half of my arbalesters and all of my reavers. And it was really easy to do so because they're both plastic, so you can just use plastic cement, really easily posable. And a very cheap way as well to, you know, get the models that you need, and a very accessible one as well. So you don't really need a 3D printer to, you know, make this army complete. And as you can see, I mixed in these converted crossbows with the regular metal arbalesters, and they look perfectly fine. And what I did, I used blue stuff to press mold the original arbalester shields and made copies of them using like a green stuff and milliput blend. There's plenty of tutorials on YouTube about blue stuff. If you're not familiar with it, I definitely recommend you look it up, because it's so good for copying bits and making conversions. It's really fun to do. All right, mateys, let's go into some general tactics and how to play with the Corsairs. I've already alluded to some of the things while discussing the individual profiles, but I'll take it from the top. The Corsairs are a very shoot-heavy army. You should have a lot of arbalesters in your army, and this kind of dictates the way that you play. This doesn't always mean that you have to sit back and let your opponent come to you. As with all things, it really depends on the scenario. So the first thing, as always, what you should do is, what's the objective? You know, is it something that I have to play for, like, you know, seize the prize or contest of champions, where it's like literally impossible to win the game if you're not taking the objective or playing for the main objective? Or could it be a scenario where you could get away with just denying your opponent points and getting the win on banner, leader, and breaking VPs, something along those lines? So that should be your first, and you know, the thing you should analyze. Like, do I have to do something, or do I have the luxury of, you know, manipulating the battlefield and taking maybe a more cautious approach and a more, you know, more. That's the word. Or do I have like the luxury of a more calculating approach? So let's assume that it's one of those scenarios where you have a bit more space to work with because you don't have to go somewhere immediately. The next thing that you have to worry about, or what you have to consider, is like, who's the shooter? Are you going to win the shooting war? The answer is usually yes, unless you're playing Assault on Helm's Deep, Assault of Lorien, or Rangers of Mirkwood. I think those are probably the only 3 armies that could outshoot you. Maybe there's a few exceptions, But in general, if you're bringing a lot of Corsairs, then you're the shoot down, so they have to come towards you, right? So you use that information, like we kind of discussed in the Ministry video, to make them come to you, to choose the advantageous position to fight in and leverage that advantage. Inflict some casualties on them as they're coming in. Use your throwing daggers as well to skirmish. And once you engage, you should have the upper hand already. You just leverage that further. Now, the army bonus, which gives backstabbers to all of your Corsair models, means that you're really incentivized to trap your opponent. So you're not really encouraged to fight in a line, even though you could with Reavers on front and Spear supports behind. You have a very potent line in terms of, number of attack rolls and things like that. But if you can, you want to envelop your opponent, or maybe make the lines chaotic, move through them, trap little pockets of their force while you're fighting the other parts somewhere else. Sometimes you just kill a few things in the middle of the line and you have this opportunity to sneak some of your models through. You should definitely do that, even if it means you trap yourself as well when they swarm on you. You getting traps is very important because it makes you even more killy. So generally it's worth it to disrupt the lines and try and get these little micro traps going on. Corsairs are an incredibly killy glass cannon-y force. So what you'll usually see happening is that someone's going to get broken in the game. That's going to happen. Quite frequently it's either going to be both, or it's just going to be your opponent. What I mean by that is that it really escalates, right? You can leverage your numbers, you can leverage your rerolls, you can win a lot of fights, you can kill a lot of things. So if things are going poorly though, you also die, but usually you're taking some of the opponents with you. So frequently you'll be able to get the breakpoints, but you have to be cautious not to get broken yourself as well. But you can't always stop it because you're so fragile. You have defense 4 at the highest, maybe 5 on like a hero or something, but that's about it. So yeah, ironically, the armored horse of Suladon is like one of the most survivable thing in your army. So you're going to lose models. There's no other way about it. What this does mean is that you have to be careful that you're not giving up victory points to get the army advantage and then kill your opponent too quickly. Like if it's one of those games that goes to quarter, you run the risk of quartering your enemy too quickly, especially if you bring a lot of Reavers because they can't shield. And this is also why I recommend running shields in your spear supporters, not just because defense 4 is nicer than defense 3, but also if you're running the risk of breaking your opponent too quickly, at least you can shield with all of your arbalesters and your regular warriors, and it's just your Reavers that are going to be doing some killing. But they might also already be dead because they're the first in the combat and they only have defense 3, so they do tend to disappear quite quickly, but not before they've done some really serious damage. So the other thing that's about Corsairs is it really rewards good positioning. I already mentioned it a little bit, but the other thing that it really rewards is the combination of Dalgamah and your banners. If you're running a bosun, Dalgamah and Suladon, you already have 3 banner effects in your army. Suladon is a 6-inch banner, so he'll cover a lot. If you have your bosun somewhere else, he'll cover that area with banner rerolls, usually the Reavers because they're nearby. And Dalgamar should be somewhere in the middle of your army to provide that extra reroll on top of the other banner rerolls. And also because his 3 might is really good for calling heroic moves, etc. with, because he doesn't really have any special heroics. I think he just has like strength, which honestly nobody ever cares about. So yeah, he's just your might battery for moves and things like that, and maybe a hero combat, something along those lines. Your infantry heroes are really good at bullying small, like medium-ish opponent heroes, so like your generic captains or your Ingolds or your Madrills or things like that. You have fight 5 on them, so especially if they're fight 4 enemy models, you're really good at just bullying them with them. Or Suladon and Dalamir can combine it really well with a hero combat slingshot. Like Dalamir could call a combat, Suladon could call a strike, and suddenly your enemy heroes, if they're exposed, have to call a strike because they run a risk of getting Suladon into them, and things like that. Your heroes are pretty potent for their points, and you shouldn't be afraid to use them. All of them except your leader are pretty expendable, unless it's a banner scenario in which you want to be more careful with Suladon, because if he dies, the banner is gone. And you know, of course, in a scenario like Assassinate or Fog of War or Clash by Moonlight, obviously heroes are a little bit more important to keep alive. But generally, once their resources are spent, you don't really mind them dying. You know, you just want to use them and leverage that, you know, the resource that they have and the attacks that they have. So yeah, that's basically pretty much it for basic tactics. Use your numbers, use your shooting advantage to, you know, draw your opponents towards you. Get that snowball going where you kill your opponent faster than they kill you, and eventually you'll get the traps going and kill even faster, and just, you know, leverage the strengths of your army in order to get the victory. It doesn't always have to be by the main objective. Winning just because you broke them and killed their leader and were unbroken yourself can be just good enough. And that's how Corsair rolls. Sometimes they absolutely smash the opponent and come home with a 12-0 victory, and sometimes you go like, nah, you're probably going to get the objective, but I'm just going to kill you enough so that it doesn't matter, and then you win anyways. So that's basically how Corsair plays. So let's go into some of the more niche aspects of Corsair play that I've learned throughout my tournament games. So first off, about Dalamir, he makes it for a great leader in the same vein as Denethor sometimes, in that you don't really need him. He's only got 2 might points. Yes, he's got 3 attacks with Bane and King, so it's pretty scary in combat, and smoke bombs are pretty cool. But if you're worried about losing leader VPs, you can keep him safe and not lose out on too much value. His 3 fate does mean that you can just throw him into warriors relatively safely, and if you botch your combat, then you know, you might take a wound, but you'll probably be able to save it with fate. But if there's like really scary enemy heroes around, or lots of magic or things like that, if you want to play it safe, you can just hide him behind a terrain piece, and you know, his stalk unseen means that he's really safe there, which I sometimes do if it's really necessary, if it's going to be close and I'm like, I think I just you know, play it safe. So keep that in mind. Smoke bombs are overrated. I already mentioned it a little bit, but they're only good against monsters basically, because any hero will is going to just spend the will on it, and you don't have any other magic in your list. So, sometimes it's really useful to, you know, smoke bomb an enemy hero that has low courage. So yeah, the smoke bombs are kind of overrated. Don't get me wrong, they're really powerful, but they're usually only useful against monsters that have no will, or something like a Dragon Knight or whatever. Because anyone that gets hit by a smoke bomb and they do have will, they're going to use it, and you don't have any other means to drain enemy will. It's not like you have terror in your army or magic to really deal with it. It can be interesting to use smoke bombs on an enemy hero that has like maybe a will point or 2 and relatively low courage, if you're banking on the fact that they might run away the next turn, you know, if your opponent is broken. So much like you want to be careful with Dalamir, you can be pretty reckless with Suladon unless it's a better scenario. He's a very powerful combat hero. Use him as such. Use him to bully enemy heroes. Use him to, you know, whack a hole in the enemy lines so you can get your traps going. You know, get heroic combat slingshots off, or use his mobility to, you know, threaten objectives and things like that. That's what he's there for. He's just there to be a real headache for your opponent. So that's also why I usually include him in the list. He does a lot for the army. A big thing to talk about is shooting into combat, both with throwing daggers and with crossbows. Shooting in combat is really, really strong, especially when it's really decent shooting, which, you know, 4+ for a strength 4 hit is nice. It's nothing to sniff at. Shooting into combat can be used in many ways. If your opponent is running a really elite army, it can be worth shooting into combat just to get kills on enemy warrior models. But usually you want to shoot into combat to hunt down enemy heroes. I already mentioned this earlier, but if a big enemy hero is in combat, you can just keep shooting into combats with that hero and slowly grind them down with shooting. But there's a few niche things that you should be aware of. First off, if an enemy hero gets dismounted and doesn't roll a 6 on the Throne Rider chart, that means they are not allowed to do anything else for that turn. They're not allowed to make strikes, but they're also not allowed to call a heroic strike. This is very important. Let's say an enemy cavalry hero like Elisar or Boromir or anything basically that's pretty big, strong, and things like, oh, I can flash kill Dalamir, charges into him while they're on a horse, and you go like, okay, cool, and you just shoot crossbows into that combat until you dehorse the opponent. If they don't roll that 6 or they don't spend might into going to 6, then they can't make strikes. They can't call a heroic strike, and then Dalamir's going to go like, that's nice, call a heroic strike, and then, you know, win the combat, roll 3 attacks to wound, and also reroll all failed wounds thanks to Bane of Kings. It can be a very nasty surprise for your opponent, and not everybody is aware of the fact that you just can't do that if you've rolled a 2 to 5, or even worse, a 1 on the Throne Rider chart. So sometimes it can be worth not shooting at a hero that's on a horse until they've made it into combat, to make it, you know, extra annoying for them for that turn. It's just something that you can do. Another thing to be aware of, that if you want to shoot on enemy warrior models to, you know, create casualties, you don't want to actually shoot at the model that's in combat. If they have a spear support, you want to shoot at the spear support, or do it behind that even. Because then the odds are bigger that you hit an enemy model. It works like this. First you roll a hit, let's assume you hit. You then roll in the way, so it's a 50-50 whether you hit yourself, or whether you hit the combat or you go through to the enemy model. But in case that you hit the combat, you get another 50-50 roll to see whether you hit yourself or the enemy. So basically there's like a 75% chance you hit the enemy, and only 25% chance that you hit yourself, instead of a straight up 50-50 when you're shooting straight into the combat. So that's another thing that you have to keep in mind there. And then finally, of course, the obvious thing is, if your enemy hero is in combat and you shoot the models, your own guys out of the combat, then they can't call a hero combat anymore, which can be really useful to, you know, pin enemy models. Things like an LSR that can call 3 heroics every turn, or the likes of Foreign or the Balrog, or anything big, scary that gets 3 hero combats or wants to spend their mind on hero combats. You can just pin in place and they can't do anything. It can be very frustrating to play against Corsairs if you have a hero like that you just don't get to use, because every time you charge something it just gets shot out of combat, and every time you get charged it gets shot out of combat, so your hero is just kind of stuck there doing nothing. What's very important in order to make all of this shooting into combat possible is Arbalaster deployment. Don't fall into the trap of, I'm going to put all of my crossbows into a single shooting warband and put them on a hill somewhere and it'll be great. Because if it's a proper tournament and it has proper terrain pieces, you will not have clear line of sight on the whole board from a single piece of terrain that you can deploy on. It just won't happen. Spread out your Arbalesters throughout your warbands. Usually if you have Dalamir and Dalgamar, you know, split them evenly between those 2 warbands. And then if you have the chance, when you deploy them, don't put all of the Arbalesters into one spot, but split those again into 2 groups, so that you have 4 different groups of Arbalesters on different positions in the battlefield with different lines of sight. Why is this important? Arbalesters can't shoot and move, they're crossbows. If you're in a bad position, you have to move. And if all of your eggs are in one basket, your opponent can just sit behind terrain and not care about you. And then the turn that you move, they can then move again to, you know, freely, because you can't shoot at them, and then maybe get to another piece of cover by the time, you know, you're somewhere where you can shoot. If you have multiple groups of Arbalesters, like in groups of 3s or 4s or something like that, then you can shoot with one group and move the other if they don't have good shots that turn. Or, you know, if you have priority, you can maybe move one group and your opponent still has this thing like, yeah, you know, he moved some of his Arbalesters, so it's relatively safe to move this turn, but there's still these other groups that can still shoot at me. And it also makes sure that once the lines clash, well, the lines, because you're Corsairs, right? You should have good enough avenues of fire on any combats you might want to shoot into. Now, this takes some practice. I messed up a lot when I first started playing Corsairs. Almost every game I wished I had put my Corsairs, especially my Arbalesters, somewhere differently when we started. So there's a bit of a learning curve here. The Corsairs really require some practice, some finesse to use properly and get the most out of them. But if you stick with it, if you don't, you know, get frustrated after the first game you tried them with, like I almost did, then you'll see that they are a very rewarding army to play if you play correctly, and they're very punishing to play against. Like if you make some small movement or deployment mistakes, Corsairs are very good at punishing the enemy for doing that. So tying into the shooting into combat, it's very important that you know your odds. Like if you hate doing probability, well, sorry, but you probably should do it a little bit. You need to know the odds of hitting your intended target, like the horse on a hero that's in combat. That's only a 25% chance, assuming you hit. You also need to know the odds of you actually wounding. You need, let's take an example. An enemy hero has charged into 2 of your models. It's Contest of Champions, so it's very important that you get rid of those 2 models that they're in combat with, so to deny them you know, the opportunity to do hero combat and to get even more kills. What are the odds of actually killing those two models? Well, you need to kill both of them, right? So maybe you should do the calculation in your head where, how likely am I to kill both of them? Because if I'm not likely to kill both of them with the shooting that I have available to me, maybe I should not shoot at all, but instead charge as many models into the combat as possible, or at least put spear supports behind them and, you know, have the highest chance of punishing a whiff from my opponent. Or take some other mitigating action, like moving a single model behind the models that have been charged, so that if they do heroic combat, they can only charge one model extra instead of two and get even more kills in the case of Contest of Champions. So if you're taking an Arbalest shot and you shoot into combat with an enemy hero, first you need to hit, it's a 50-50. Then you need to hit your own guys, which goes down to a 25%. Then you need to wound your own guys, which again needs to roll for 4, so it's again a 50-50. So you're down to 12.5% chance per crossbow shot of killing your own guys. If we're talking throwing daggers, because you're so desperate to get these guys out of the combat, because it's the difference between you winning or losing a game, you might even move some of your spear supports close so they become within 6-inch range. The odds are even worse because you're hitting on 5s with them, right? It's a strength 3 hit. So if they're not Corsairs that have defense 3, so basically your guys with shields, then you need 5s to hit and also 5s to wound. So those odds become lower and lower and lower to the point where it might not be worth trying it anymore. So run the probabilities, do some experimentation. There's tools online that you can use, like what are the odds of so many shots or so many dice rolls to get this many results and things like that. Get a feel for when is it worth it, when is it not worth it. And of course, there's always the outside chance that it's not going to work despite the odds being really good. Just like sometimes you just have to try it when the odds are really shit. Because you need to have that Hail Mary shot, otherwise you're just going to lose anyway, so you might as well try and maximize the odds for it, right? So it's kind of this risk-reward scenario, and this army really requires you to think about that. I mean, most armies do. It's just, in this game, it's generally a good idea to have a good understanding of probabilities and when something does make sense and something doesn't make sense. Like the odds of rolling a 6 with 3 dice is 42%, it's not 50% like people think, things like that. Yeah, I already mentioned this earlier in the base tactics, but a win is a win, right? Don't go overboard. You don't need to risk everything to get the 12-0, and if you can play really safe and be almost guaranteed to win on breaking and leader points alone. Similarly, you don't want to go overboard on killing the enemy too much and quartering them too quickly. I already mentioned this earlier, but it's something that's so easy to do, right? But you can also do this against the opponent. If you're going to lose the shooting war, or if you're not the beatdown, but it's a game where you're thinking like, I can take this by just playing the objective. Let's say it's domination, and you can take 3 spots guaranteed and contest the last one, then it doesn't matter if they kill your leader or break you. If the game ends and you still have all the things, right? So leave a quarter of your army behind, or well, a little bit less. Charge forward with everything you have, get shot to pieces, stab as much as you can, feint as much as you can, use your banner rerolls to lose all of your combats, and just get yourself to die and run away and get quartered as quickly as possible. And your army will literally melt before your eyes because you're so low defense. Like, if you do anything you can to lose fights, you will see that Corsairs are really weak, which can be in your advantage. If you think that you're up against Assault on Helm's Deep or Mirkwood Rangers or something like that, and they're sitting somewhere behind the forest or doing stuff like that, and they play the game of, I'm going to weaken you first and then I'm going to grab the detectives, you can just be like, cool, I'm going to move forward. And when you're almost there, you're like, I'm going to march and pin you in the spot where you didn't expect me get pinned. Okay, now you're killing me. I don't care. I'm going to get quartered and I'm going to win the game. So keep that in mind, that's also a possibility. All right, that's it for niche tactics. There's a few other things that you'll discover as you're playing the army, but they're not really things that explain well. It's more of like a feeling, like when do you commit heroes, when don't you commit heroes. I can't really give clear-cut examples. It's just something that you have to learn as you play the army. And besides, I have to keep a few secrets for myself, otherwise everybody's going to roll right over me whenever I play Corsairs again. I've already had it happen where people in the local tournament scene watched my Eastlings video and then were like, oh yeah, now I know what to do against you and how to play around Brogan. I'm like, cool. Maybe I shouldn't have made that video, but you know, we do it because we love the hobby and we love sharing the insights with you all. So let's move to list building. Always very important part of playing this game is make sure that you bring the right army to begin with. List building for Corsairs is relatively straightforward. You begin with Dalamir. He's a hero of legend. He's really good. He's basically a mandatory pick for Corsairs, in my opinion. And he's going to be your leader because he's legend. And the only other leader you could have is Suladon at that point, but you'd rather have Dalamir be your leader out of those two candidates. After Dalamir, my personal first pick is a bosun. But ideally, you want, in addition to the bosun, you want either Dalgamar or Suladon as well. At very low points, that's a tough ask, so you might just leave home with just Dalamir and a bosun and a whole bunch of guys and be really low on might. But because of the low might, you really want to add Dalgamar or Suladon or both as soon as you can. Why do I choose the bosun over the other ones? Well, because of the reavers. So usually it kind of looks like this. You have a bosun with some reavers, something like 8 reavers in a warband, and then 4 Corsairs with spear supports works really well. And then the bosun himself, I also give a spear so that he can start off with spear supporting some reavers, and then when the fighting gets more thick and it doesn't matter as much as if he dies, the bosun will also go into combat using his 2 attacks. And Dalamir's warband will have more regular Corsairs and Arbalesters. So the Arbalesters are a third of your force, give or take, maybe a little bit lower, but you should really try and get a good amount of Arbalesters because they're really strong. And then you'll find yourself running only a limited amount of, you know, face-to-face warriors, as it were, because a pretty large chunk of the warband of Dalamir is going to be Arbalesters. Now, as you add more other warbands, especially if you add Dalgamar, you'll find that you know, evens out a little. Because you don't really want to add Arbalesters in the bosun warband unless you're running really low points, you're only bringing a few reavers, then you could, you know, shoehorn a few Arbalesters in there and have yet another position where you can deploy Arbalesters. But basically the recipe is, you know, choose your heroes, and then have a third of Arbalesters, have at least a few reavers, and then add Corsairs, you know, to fill out your numbers. A few will have, you know, just shield and sword, but most of them will have spears so that they can support reavers, they can support Arbalesters if you choose to fight with them when you're not going to win the shooting war, and you can, you know, support your heroes. If you can, you add Suladon with some Serpent Riders, you know, to contest for objectives, have some mobility and have that banner. If you can't add Suladon, you take a single Black Numenorian with banner because you really want to be able to have those banner VPs if it's one of those scenarios. You don't want to get into a situation where technically you're the shooting army, but you're behind on banner victory points, so you kind of have to go to your opponent, because otherwise you can just lose on time if they're just going to hide behind terrain. It sucks. You just don't want to be in that situation. So an example list, let's say a 750 point list, which is a relatively popular amount. You have Dalamir, he's your leader. You have Dalgamar, you have a bosun, and you have Suladon. Suladon brings 2 Serpent Riders with him. The bosun has 8 reavers and 4 Corsairs with shield and spears. And Dalamir and Dalgamar both have something like 7 Arbalesters in the warband for a total of 14. And the rest is just Corsairs, some of just a shield and some of spear and shield, just to round out your numbers. That'll give you a really solid model count, like a pretty high model count, with some really high hitting power and some really good shooting. And it'll allow you to play at all aspects of the game and really punish your opponent for making mistakes. You'll find that when you're building a list for Corsairs, there's these really weird breakpoints where it does or doesn't make sense to bring Suladon because you do or do not run out of warband slots with your regular Corsairs. It's an army that wants a lot of numbers, so you want to kind of maximize your warband slots. And if you're bringing Suladon and you're not filling out his warband, you know, that's a bit of an impact on your numbers, so you want to make the most out of the warband slots for your other heroes. But you have these weird point levels where it doesn't make much sense. Like I think 650 is one of those levels where if you bring all of the heroes, you just don't have enough bodies. But if you drop Dalgamar, then you have leftover points, so you'd have to like fill up Suladon warband with some Haradrim, which I personally don't prefer doing because they don't work they work all right with Corsairs, but I want to play Corsairs because I want to play Corsairs, right? I don't want it to be this weird hybrid of like desert people and pirates. No, I want pirates and a few guys on horse. So at 650, I actually end up dropping Suladon and just max out on the warband slots and bring this Numenorian with banner. But then on 600, I would again then drop Delgamar and take Suladon instead, because the breakpoints work out differently. So that's just something I found with list building. The list almost writes itself because the ratios are pretty clear. You want a third Arbalests, you want some Reavers, and the rest you just fill up with pirates. But sometimes the warband slots just kind of work weird, and you're like, can I bring Suladon or can I not bring Suladon? And of course, the higher you go in points, the easier it is to work around that. But at really low points, it becomes really awkward, and there's at like medium points, there's a few of those breakpoints that are kind of weird. So if you have any questions about army lists, do leave a comment. I try to reply to every question that I see in there. Like the video, subscribe, blah blah blah, the usual call outs. We do really appreciate the support. Our videos have been doing really well, and we're really grateful for all of the positive feedback that we've been getting, and all of the questions that we've been getting, and the engagement of the community. I mean, that's why we do it, right? We just do it out of love for the hobby, and we're not really making any money off of this. It's just something that we enjoy. So moving on from list building, let's talk about how to beat the Corsairs. So how do you beat the Corsairs? They're an incredibly powerful army. They can be very scary to face up against, especially if you're like this army with, low fight value, or maybe very little shooting, or not so much mobility. It can feel like the Corsair player can dictate the entire game, and there's not that much you can do about it. And for some matchups and some scenarios, this is true. There will be situations where it is really hard for you to defeat the Corsair player. Of course, there's always a chance, but some matchups are just generally not favorable. That being said, there are quite a few things that you can do. It always starts with analyzing the objectives, just like how you should. I keep hammering this because I keep facing off against people in tournaments. I don't mean to speak badly about other people, right? Everybody's in this for the hobby because they love doing it, but they'll get lost in the game. They'll try to do things because they want to kill my models or kill my hero. They'll go after Brogear after all of the will has been spent, when he doesn't matter for the game anymore. Things like that, like they lose sight of the objective. And it starts with deployment. It starts before deployment. It starts with choosing the table edge. It starts when you have to put objectives down. Think about it. Think what your odds are. Think what your opponent is going to do. And in the case of Corsairs, if you give them a chance, they're going to sit somewhere and they're going to shoot the hell out of you. And then they're going to surround you and cut your army to pieces. So don't make it easy for them. Make it hard for them. Make them work for it. Or if you think you can't stop them and you think you can win on objectives, do the thing that I just mentioned and just run at them and die. Quarter yourself, break yourself as quickly as possible, hope that the game ends on time while you have higher victory points. So you start with that. Odds are that you're not the shooting army, unless you're playing Assault on Lothlorien, Assault on Helm's Deep, Rangers of Mirkwood, which means you have to move forward. But how you move forward and where you move forward and what kind of turn you move forward is really important. Ideally, you move into throwing dagger range on a turn where you lost priority, so that the Corsair player has this choice of, do I stay still and let you come towards me, or do I reposition a little bit but have the risk of you moving into throwing dagger range, and my free turn of throwing daggers is hitting on 5s instead of on 4s. While you're advancing, you of course want to minimize your losses. Use your terrain, use marches if you must, or drum or something along those lines. Put expendable units in front of your heroes so they don't immediately get shot off their horses, or keep your cavalry behind terrain until lines of clash, and then spend a turn or two moving them up while they're relatively safe. Things like that. Like, consider your approach. Be aware of opportunities to mess up the Corsair formation, be it through magic or just threatening something like hero combat slingshot that they have to keep into account, or some cavalry that's threatening the flanks, things like that. Like, keep them on their toes. Don't give them like free reign to wrap around you and envelop you without punishment. Like, you have to keep in mind that that's what they're going to try to do, and you have to try and counter that. We went over this in the shooting into combat section, but you can't rely on a big hero too much to do damage. The Corsair player is likely going to shoot their own models out of the combat and wound your hero in the process. It's going to be very difficult for you to prevent leader wounds unless it's like this defense 7 or a higher hero of a lot of fate that you can keep relatively safe from crossbow fire as you're moving up. The odds are that the Corsair player is either going to wound or kill your leader, because they're going to be looking to do it. But that doesn't mean that you have to keep your leader behind, because if their leader isn't there to get shot at, other things are going to get shot at, right? So it's just damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, but you have to be aware, and that's what the Corsair player is trying to do. And you can't rely on your big heroes to get hero combats off and things like that. So what you can do with your heroes is see if there's an opportunity to hunt the Corsair heroes, because they can't shoot those out of combat that easily. And if you take those off the board, that's a fair amount of chunks that at least you earn back with your heroes. You might take quite a few wounds in the process if they do decide to shoot into the combat. But at least you'll have something to show for it, rather than just, 18 points of Corsair models that were killed by their own shooting. And then you're like, yay, and you do that 2 turns and then your hero is dead. It's not really worth it. You might have to dismount your combat heroes if you see an opportunity to try and charge into Corsair hero, because if your horse gets shot out from under you, then you don't get to make strikes unless you roll that 6. So that you expect that to happen, you might as well dismount in advance so that you don't have to roll that 6, right? You just dismount it. So, I mean, on the other hand, the horse does take a wound for you, so that's 1 less crossbow that can do a wound on your hero. So then again, there's like considerations to make there. I assume this goes without saying, but I should say it anyways. Keep in mind that the opponent will try to trap you and kill you. So you might have to be more spread out. Don't have this tight shield wall formation because they're trying to envelop you or ram their models in the middle and get these micro traps going on. Give yourself some breathing room, right? Backing away a full inch is more than people think. I see people do it wrong a lot at tournaments as well. Like they think, oh no, this is an inch, and then you measure it like, no, you didn't back away an inch, or you did back away an inch, but that wasn't a straight line. You would have touched this model. Like, yes, it's a sportsmanship game. Sometimes you have to be a little bit, nagging about it if you're at top tables, but just be aware that people underestimate the amount of space that it actually takes for a model to back away an inch in a straight line, and how easy it is to get trapped even on your own models, even if you can make way, because the model that makes way might not be able to make way a full inch because another friendly model is nearby and things like that. If you have priority, and this also goes for the Corsair player, choosing the order in which the combats happen is so important. Don't just go left to right, because you're going to get yourself trapped for no reason, while you could have done another combat first and maybe get rid of the trap or stuff like that. Similarly for the Corsair player, it's very important because you might be able to get some traps going, and you want to do those first while they're trapped, or maybe you can fight a combat where if you do that first, they can back away, but then they have to move a spear support off of another combat that hasn't fought yet. And then, that spear support can no longer fight in that combat, and you create an advantage that way. So it's very important that you just choose the order of your combats and don't just go left to right, and spend some time thinking about it. And if there's ever any confusion about whether something will be trapped, go over it with your opponent before the fight happens, or before the fight phase starts. Like, this one's trapped, right? Or was it your intention to trap this model? Or you think there's enough space to back away? Maybe you can measure it. Over communicate to avoid frustration and disappointment with your opponent, because it's such an important aspect of this army. It is for any army really, because traps are just powerful. Getting double strikes is amazing, but with Corsairs it's doubly potent. For the type of army that could beat Corsairs is something that doesn't really care that much as it gets shot at, and can outfight the Corsairs and have like enough durability to make that work. And the army that comes to mind to me instantly is Easterlings, especially now with the Emperor. Easterlings have a drum, they have high defense, and with the Emperor they have fight 5, which is higher than the Corsairs. They have an insane banner range, so they have rerolls coming out of their ass. They have pike supports to really leverage their numbers somewhere so they can spread themselves out. The phalanx rule makes it very hard to trap them. There's usually a way that they can back off. And when they do win against the Corsairs, which they'll do frequently because of the higher fight value and the banner rerolls and the pikes, they will kill because you are defense 3 or maybe defense 4 at best. So if you manage to get a nice engagement with an Easterling army against Corsairs, most of the time you should be fine, and you'll... Hello, mosquito. If you get a clean engagement with the with the Easterling army against Corsairs, most of the time you'll be fine, and you'll just tear through the army and be able to claim the objectives and do things like that. So an army like the Eastlings could do well. Similarly, I think Minas Tirith with Banner Boromir has a fighting chance if he gets there in one piece. Especially if like there's a Madril or something to call marches or something along those lines. A number heavy elf list also has good chances, or something that's very mobile and very elite, like a flying heavy list, or something with magic to really thwart the Corsair and put some models in the way of shooting, or like a flying creature that can hero combat slingshot and go into the arbalesters and mess up the arbalesters and things like that. There's anything that kind of disrupts the Corsair plan should do decently well if you're playing it properly and the Corsair player also doesn't see it coming, or has a counter plan. It's a competitive army. It's going to be hard to have an answer to everything in the tournament, which is the beauty of this game. And if you have an answer to Corsairs, you might get beaten by something else. That being said, I do hope that the knowledge that I've shared today will either help you play Corsairs better or play against Corsairs better. As always, may the dice be in your favor. If you enjoyed this video, please let us know. We do like to interact in the comments. Maybe share it to someone that you think could benefit from this. We'll also take suggestions in the comments. We can't promise to do every army out there because I don't like speaking about armies that I don't have experience with. And I hope you appreciate that we only cover armies that I feel comfortable talking about, because I don't want to share knowledge on something that's secondhand, right? I want to have played an army at a tournament and done well with it, and ideally multiple tournaments, before I feel that I know what I'm talking about and I can share it with you all. So thanks everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and see you next time at Lowlands Wargaming.